Hi, everyone. Welcome to our program today. My name is Sarah Morgan, and I'm a partner in the Capital Markets and M&A group here at B&E and part of the team that regularly works on transactions in energy transition, as well as part of the team that helps monitor regulatory developments. I'm thrilled today to have our tax team with us to talk to you about the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, a piece of legislation that, if enacted, will be a historic investment in climate policy. So today we're going to be covering the notable climate and energy programs and the clean energy tax provisions. There is a ton of information to unpack, as you might have guessed. So we'll be covering things at a high level for the most part, and there probably will not be time for a lot of questions at the end of the hour. So if you have a question that doesn't get covered during the presentation, please feel free to reach out directly to the speakers with any of your questions. Their emails are here on this current slide and on the CLE webpage, and they will do their best to follow up with you after the CLE. I'm super excited to introduce to you guys some of the tax members of our Band 1 ranked renewables team. We have Sean Moran, who's a tax partner in our Austin office, Lauren Collins, who's a tax partner in our Los Angeles office, and Mary Alexander, a tax counsel in our Washington, D.C. office. And these guys all work on tax matters relating to the financing of renewable energy projects, representing companies, investors, sponsors, and developers. They have lots of experience in doing this. They've worked on some of the country's largest and most complex energy financing transactions, and have engineered a lot of first-of-the-kind deals. And you don't usually see people get super excited about tax lawyers, but working with these guys is terrific because they are creative problem solvers, and they're very innovative in finding financial and legal structuring solutions that evolve with the economic and regulatory environment. And that is a skill set that is going to be very useful if this gets passed. And they've been working around the clock, both on understanding all of the elements involved in the Inflation Reduction Act, and have already had a lot of conversations with a lot of stakeholders about potential deal structuring on implementation. So I know they're going to have a lot of great insight to share with you guys today. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to the tax team.
So I'll jump in here. Thanks, Sarah. She is way kind about kind of our skills. And we all at V&E are amazed by how talented Sarah is and how much she gets accomplished, and how plugged in she is to the energy transaction. So hello, everybody. We have a great crowd here, actually. It's phenomenal. And we're really excited to be putting on the CLE. There's so much in this legislation that we are excited about, and kind of will be so helpful kind of with the energy transition. So this is kind of pretty extraordinary. There is an extraordinary amount of detail as well. About 400 pages of the 725 is just tax, chock full of tax. So we're going to hit a lot of items at a high level, as Sarah mentioned. But, I think the important thing is just, try to pick up on kind of the things that may be of particular interest to you all. And then we'd be delighted to kind of pick up the conversation. Frequently, when we're prompted with kind of questions and thoughts and ideas and maybe concepts, that's when we really feel like we can kind of help you all kind of add value, just in terms of how you're thinking about yourself, how you might invest in things, how you might organize yourself, and all that type of thing. So please keep questions coming. We do have, it's just the three of us on the phone. We have legions at V&E here that are kind of contributing to this effort and trying to get, our arms around a lot of the different features. This is not just your regular tax bill. It has a lot of wrinkles in it that are essentially kind of brand new to this space that we all need to get, smarter about, educate ourselves, reach into other areas of the law. The Clean Air Act we're learning about. We're learning about kind of prevailing wage and kind of, which is it, Lauren, the Bacon, the Bacon Act. So there's just a lot there, and we have a lot of folks kind of contributing to this effort. So if it's not just even tax related, if there's other things in there that you want to touch upon, please reach out to us, and we'll put you in touch with the right folks. So I'm going to jump in. I'm going to jump in at a high level. Try to keep this, somewhat interesting. It is tax, so we're trying to keep it interesting. I like to always joke, we're not litigators, kind of like just in terms of our presentation necessarily. We're tax types. We frequently kind of just sit in a dark room trying to figure something out. But at least we're substance based. The litigators, not so much all the time. Sorry to the litigators, I couldn't help that. So I'm just going to jump in. Could you next slide, next one after that, please. Okay, so this whole effort here by Congress is all about this energy transition. I know everybody's heard about this a million times, kind of thing, but you really need to set the context of what this is kind of trying to accomplish. And it's literally trying to go from carbon intense, power production, industrials, transportation, you name it, kind of just in terms of what emits carbon, and trying to go into a carbon neutral kind of setting. And I like to say that's just not green, it's also kind of clean, right? It's just, can we figure out a way to kind of move from kind of one way that we kind of generate power or combustion or otherwise, and go in another direction? To do that, transitioning here, to successfully transition, kind of what it's going to take, it's pretty extraordinary, right? We have to significantly increase power production from green and carbon neutral sources. If you think about, we've been working, kind of myself and Lauren and now Mary, kind of for years on wind and solar. Wind and solar contribute like 15% of kind of the power kind of consumption kind of that's out there. And thinking is, if you study some of the energy transition kind of thinking here, that we need to increase wind and solar like 4 times, maybe 5 times, from 15% to in the 50s or 60%. So we need to significantly increase power production from these other sources. The next item has to do with kind of what do we do with kind of all the coal and oil and gas kind of production? We can't just turn our backs kind of on what's out there. We're still going to have carbon emissions, if nothing else, so we can have a stable grid. But the thinking there is are there ways that we can kind of capture the carbon? And many of you that I've spoken with and the team has spoken with here, 45Q is kind of, the topic du jour, right? Can we figure out a way to kind of keep things clean? Then, one of my favorite topics is kind of, can we spur development into kind of hydrogen, our most abundant element, right? It's extraordinary, kind of just in terms of the opportunity that's presented in hydrogen. And this legislation is kind of chock full of opportunity with respect to hydrogen, and we'll hit upon that. And it goes deep. It's power production. It has industrial application. It has heavy transportation. I know, we still have a lot of work to do with hydrogen, but it's something that's, out there maybe as a significant opportunity that we all should kind of start like turning to and focusing on. Another favorite topic of mine are nukes, right? This legislation has the oddest feature. We'll hit about it a little later, but it says for existing nuclear facilities that exist before this legislation is acted, we're going to institute a production tax credit. Trying to take our nuclear kind of fleet of facilities that are on average well over 40 years old, and kind of seeing if there's a way that it makes sense to keep those keep them going and economically viable. If you just pause there, nuclear contributes 20% of our kind of our power production in the United States. So just to turn our back on it entirely is going to be, I think, a mistake just in terms of kind of how we go to carbon neutral. Next slide, please.
And just before we move too far off of hydrogen, hydrogen is something that V&E has been working on for quite a while now. We actually put on one of these CLEs on hydrogen, so you can go and find it on the website, and you'll see some subset of this group talking about hydrogen in depth if you're interested.
So just to run down kind of the rest of the things, what do we need to do to transition, right? We've got to figure out kind of how do we store energy with all of these intermittent resources now, right? It's grid stability and it's intermittency. Right now, the contribution of storage in the power market is well below 1%. It might be 0.1%. So the growth opportunity there is significant. And finally, Congress is kind of, from a policy standpoint, said, look, storage on a standalone basis, we will support and provide subsidies to in the form of credits. Next issue is transmission. We need to get the power from kind of, the places where it's really sunny and really windy to kind of the load centers. This bill does not hit on transmission. It was kind of in the legislation last year, but it's not in this as kind of an ITC. More to come on that, I hope, right? We really need to kind of solve the transmission, not only kind of onshore, but offshore. We have the neat little photo there to keep you guys a little interested kind of with the offshore. How do we get the power from all of these offshore kind of planned facilities onshore? It's not an easy solution. And then the next few provisions are kind of pretty neat. It's trying to bring into the United States the manufacturing capabilities for all of these things that I just kind of hit on. Can we kind of build kind of and develop a lot of the components that go into these facilities? It goes to a lot of issues, right? Just not only jobs, which are super important, but it's also kind of, security. Can we build our own stuff? There's a transition here that we'll touch upon as well with respect to new technologies. And I should slow myself down there. The new technology is kind of basically everything that we all know today: wind, solar, hydro, geothermal, go down the list. It basically will operate kind of the way it does now in terms of how it looks at kind of whether you're carbon neutral. But the provisions are clever in the sense that maybe we don't know about all the asset classes that are out there. So if you come along with something that kind of is generating power in a carbon neutral manner, you will be able to tap into this credit. There are extensions with respect to renewable fuels and clean fuel production. There are extensions and some new credits in renewable fuels and the carbon fuel production that you all should be aware of that are in that space. And there's a lot, and it's somewhat controversial as well. There's a lot out there with respect to EV and EV charging at the moment, and it's a bit of a point of contention with this legislation that we'll touch upon in just a moment. Next slide, please. Okay, so that is kind of, I have to verify my attendance to this thing. Just blocked out the screen. And I'm a host, so I can't vote. So anyway, successfully transitioning to continue on, right? We've been talking about all of these kind of opportunities and what's out there. We need an extraordinary amount of capital. If you start looking at the math of some of kind of the projections in terms of the cost here, it's 3 or 4 trillion a year. It's over 100 trillion, up into the high 100 trillions are the estimates, and it's probably gone up from there since I first saw kind of the cost involved here. So we really need capital from all sources. This legislation starts to open up some opportunity for some other kind of investing to come in. So we'll touch upon that, but something to kind of just keep your eye on. And then the monetization of credits. I've resisted using the word monetization of a credit for most of my career, right? That it's a real tax item. You're not just going to convert it to cash. And here we have this legislation that basically calls it that. We are going to be awash. Once we start to show you the number of credits here, we are going to be awash in credits. And how do we kind of turn those into something that might help some of the projects, right? Do we have enough tax capacity at the corporate level for the most part, and some other kind of pockets to monetize all these credits, or can we kind of move them around efficiently? And then I just took a shot with respect to the clarification of the law. I and all of my colleagues here at the firm are hopeful that the government continues to kind of pursue this transition, and probably more importantly, Treasury and the IRS actually, get back into the business of leading with respect to kind of providing guidance on a regular basis, providing rulings on the private level for a lot of the issues that we're going to struggle with kind of as we start to interpret this legislation.
Right. As Sean mentioned, there's a lot of new concepts in here: prevailing wage, domestic content, monetization, and there's a number, although we have 400 pages of legislation, there's a number of calls to action for Treasury to put out guidance in the form of regulations or notices. So there will be more to come. This will be an ever-evolving area, assuming this legislation gets passed.
No, thanks, Lauren. That's so true. Next page, please. Okay, so we're into the transition now, but just trying to be mindful of kind of the effect it's going to have on a lot of folks. This transition it's going to take time. And what's been tough about kind of the wind and solar space in particular is we've had kind of these fits and starts with respect to kind of the availability of credits. They've expired on a regular basis, and it's exhausting, right? I think since I've been doing this, I think the wind credit itself has expired 4 times. And then we had this begun construction legislation, all this type of stuff. What this legislation is going to do now is kind of give runway, super important. So folks can kind of get into this, take their time a little, understand kind of where the opportunity is, the risk, engage in analysis, and still have the availability of the credits for a meaningful period of time. So it'll be worth the effort, is the point. We're displacing kind of, jobs in areas kind of throughout the country. And both of these kind of next items kind of dovetail into each other. The fair employment and the training. Fair employment goes to the prevailing wage. Kind of, should we be kind of just trying to kind of levelize kind of employment? This in some states it's going to be a touchy issue. We just need to kind of just see how this evolves. And the training is with respect to bringing apprentices along and training them up, and making kind of our workforce capable of taking care of all these facilities. The displaced workers, there's provisions in this legislation that actually kind of focus on kind of areas where, coal mines and coal facilities and brownfield kind of facilities have closed. And there's inducements in here to kind of locate your facilities in those areas to receive increased credits. I touched upon the domestic manufacturing, kind of just encouraging our ability to kind of build stuff onshore. And then last, the security and reliability. We've heard about this a lot, particularly this year, right? Security, just being able to kind of control our own fate with our own power. And the reliability goes to the grid points, right? Do we have storage? Do we have grid stability, essentially? Do we have the capabilities with storage? Do we have the capabilities with, transmission? Can we build that out? Next slide, please. I'm going to just interrupt myself here on this slide. Lauren, Mary, and I have been trying to kind of project kind of the passage of this legislation, and our handicapping is pretty awful up to date, up until now, at least, just in terms of kind of how this might play out. You all, and we're doing the same, is just kind of following what's happening in the government. We do have some insight and some access to kind of some information just in terms of how this is developing. We've tried to help out with kind of folks understanding kind of provisions, kind of, in the tax writing committees and stuff like that. But it remains to be seen. We have, the cinema drama with respect to carried interest and some other items. We have the issues coming out of the senator from Michigan with respect to the EV credits. We have positive reports from Moody's with respect to kind of the impact of this legislation. We have a JCT issuance that is becoming more controversial than helpful at this point, just in terms of, the issuance of kind of where that came from kind of in the government. So it hopefully we know soon. I think the vote, Lauren, what do we think? It's on Saturday or Sunday?
With any luck. Yeah. Yeah. And just one other thing to mention. I mean, the Senate parliamentarian has not even kind of released any changes to this legislation. So everything we're going to talk about today is based off of the legislation that was released last Wednesday, but is certainly subject to change. That there are things in there, some of the things that Sean touched on, like prevailing wage and apprenticeship, that could be subject to change. Again, it's hard to handicap this stuff. But for the time being, we've just kind of based our presentation on what we know so far.
Yeah, so things could change based on, senators having input or bird bath changes. So
here we are, we're talking about all this energy transition and all that type of thing, kind of stuff down on the ground. And Congress has used just basically the one tool it has with respect, well, that's not fair, but one of the tools it has with respect to kind of motivating behavior, attracting investment, supporting economic policy. Congress has used the tax code, as many of you know, for quite some time, to try to kind of build support and investment and success with respect to kind of green and renewable and clean facilities. And what they've done, they usually use two tools. They use the production tax credit and they use the investment tax credit. The production tax credit is what it sounds like, right? It's generally been kind of with respect to kind of facilities that you're trying to kind of support the revenues over a period of time. And wind is the classic example of that, right? Not so expensive. It's expensive, but not so expensive on the front end. But the revenues were low for the longest time with respect to wind facilities because it was an intermittent producer of power. So the PTC subsidized revenue. The ITC was initially addressed at kind of helping out with the upfront cost. Some of the early solar transactions were very expensive. So it was trying to kind of help that early on kind of in the process. And this whole legislation is you're going to hear PTC and ITC, on a regular basis kind of going forward from this point forward in this presentation. Next slide, please. And I've already kind of hinted what's going on here, right? You need tax capacity and tax equity investors to monetize the credits historically, right? You need to be a taxpayer to offset your tax liability with a credit. And this legislation, and we're going to kind of get into this with some level of detail, because there's quite a bit of interest with respect to direct pay, credit transferability, and then the extension of the carryback provisions. It's a very limited carryback now. What this does is kind of permit a little more generous kind of carryback of a credit if you've paid taxes in an earlier year and you have excess credits. So I'll take a breath there, I think, and hand it over to Mary, I believe.
Yeah, we can go to the next slide. Then the next one. So I'm just going to hit on very quickly sort of the revenue raisers that are in this bill. I think as everyone's probably aware, Manchin did not want this legislation to add to the deficit. So that was one of the keys here. So on the tax side, the revenue raisers are this corporate introduction of the corporate AMT, changes to carried interest, and increased IRS tax enforcement. The corporate AMT provision was in a prior iteration of legislation. It's similar to that, but not quite the same. So it would be if you have over $1 billion of adjusted financial statement income, sort of on average over a 3-year period, there would be an AMT calculation based on 15% of that amount. One thing that is different between this and prior proposals, or that sort of once you trip into being an AMT taxpayer in this legislation, you're kind of in that world where you're going to have to compute it every year. Like Lauren and Sean both said, this is all sort of subject to regulations. There's a specific out where the IRS could issue regulations that sort of provide otherwise with respect to that point. The big point here, though, with everything that we're going to discuss subsequently is that general business credits, Section 38 credits, can be used to offset your AMT liability, right? So that's a, taxpayers that find themselves in the AMT situation should really, think about their ability to utilize credits, especially with just the vast expansion of the credit world that would happen in addition with this legislation. Carried interest, there's a lot of talk about this, going from 3 to 5 years. The 5 years is kind of a wishy-washy on the 5 years, because in the current version, it's a sort of a substantially all test that has to do with your partnership interest or the partnership's assets. When has substantially all of those been acquired? So it could be longer than 5 years. And then IRS tax enforcement, that's one of those ones where, you're going to get more than, you spend $1, you're going to get more than $1 back. So those are kind of the revenue raisers that are included from the tax side in the IRA. We can flip to the next slide. So then this slide is really just to give you a, visual of, just how much this legislation includes. Like Sean mentioned the number of pages, but right, you can see, and you put 2 columns on a PowerPoint, you can't even fit all the credits on one side. So then there's also the revised credit structure, which we'll hit on in a second. But just again, the big change there is the credit monetization flexibility. What we really wanted to hit on this slide is what's not in here. And Sean already mentioned the transmission property, right? There had been an ITC proposed for transmission property earlier. That is not in this legislation. Also notably absent from this legislation that had been in sort of prior iterations or similar versions is the expansion of qualifying income for publicly traded partnerships in 7704. Before it would have, allowed you to have qualifying income for the, revenues earned from renewable energy sources. So that is had been sort of expected to still be in, but was cut.
So this slide is, just before you go, this slide is entertaining, right? It's first of all, whoever came up with kind of the code provisions kind of and the numbering thereof or the lettering thereof now is Section 38 is kind of just a business credit. It kind of accumulates all these credits. And then you've got 45 going pretty much to 45 cap Z. We're hopeful that we'll have a AA soon. And 48, similarly. But joking aside, those 2 provisions used to be mutually exclusive. You were either in one or the other. The way this legislation is sorting out is you taxpayer decide which one you want to be in, what makes sense for kind of your facility. And we're going to get out of kind of trying to figure out whether it should be based on production or investment basis. It's kind of like you choose, and they basically run in tandem throughout here.
And there's also some limited abilities to stack these credits on top of each other. The one that I think is kind of most obvious is the ability to pair kind of a renewable electricity type credit, so your production tax credit or investment tax credit, with the clean hydrogen credit. So any renewables being used to produce clean hydrogen could potentially get a credit as well as the hydrogen production under the legislation. And there may be other examples of stacking.
Yeah, no, with the ITC, right, or the PTC on just solar that is built in the right place, has the prevailing wage, domestic content, all of the things that we're going to hit upon. You get stacking where it becomes 50 or 60% of the ultimate cost of the facility. It's very, very large. Sorry, Mary, go ahead.
No, all good. We can flip to the next slide. Next slide. Okay, so we're going to backtrack just for a second and not talk about the IRA, just to level set everyone. I know a lot of you, this is going to put you to sleep because you're so familiar with it already. But just for those of you who are not, there are some pieces of this legislation that key off of when you begun construction. And begun construction is a term of art in this space. While it can definitely mean, you went out to the field and you put your solar panels in place and, you fired up the property, right? That's not all it is, right? There's 2 safe harbors that have been issued in guidance previously in both, wind, solar, carbon capture as to sort of how you establish begun construction. There's a physical work test, and there's also a 5% spend test. The physical work test is more of a subjective test. It's, did you begin physical work of a significant nature? That can be on-site work, like, digging your holes in your foundations, or it can be off-site work, like getting a transformer manufactured. The 5% safe harbor is more objective. That's, you spend more than 5% of the cost of the facility. You incur those costs in a particular year, and that will sort of solidify your begun construction year. And then just one other thing to note is that in the current guidance, those to maintain that begun construction year, you have to have continuous progress towards completion once construction has begun. Sort of the general rule is that if you complete the facility within 4 years of the year you begun construction, you fall within a safe harbor. If you move outside of that, or unless you're in one of the years that had some COVID relief in it, you have a facts and circumstances test that you have to establish.
So this provision that what Mary just explained, it feels a little out of context here, but with all those credits that we just kind of, that you saw in the prior slides, whether you're in kind of one of those provisions or another one, or whether you're subject to kind of some of the prevailing wage rules, it will be dependent on kind of whether you have begun construction. So this is going to be a recurring theme kind of going forward here, just in terms of this presentation, whether you're in kind of one of the statutes or you're in something else.
So we can flip to the next slide and I'll get to one of those places in a second. So first, how does the structure, the new credit structure, what does that mean? Well, right now, if you've begun construction in 2019, you'd have a 30% ITC. So I like to think of that as like the headline credit. And then that headline credit is kind of broken into 2 components. You have a base portion, and then you have sort of an additional adder on top of that. And the way they've done it is like, okay, you take your 30% and you divide it by 5, your base is going to be 6%, and that adder is 24%. So that adder is a lot, right? And that's how most of these credits in this bill are structured, as having a base credit. And then it's written most of the times as, if you satisfy certain provisions, you get 5 times that amount, right? So you would go from the 6% to the 30% in the ITC situation. But how do you get that 5 times 5x multiple on there? You have to satisfy the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements. But there are a couple outs to that. There are outs for small projects. So if you're under 1 megawatt, poll number 2, everybody needs to if you're under 1 megawatt, you have an out from having to satisfy the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements. And also, if you begun construction within 60 days of the date that the IRS releases guidance on the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements, you also are not required to satisfy the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements to receive that headline credit. So that's why, this begun construction concept, even though it's old and historic, and a lot of times it used to be like, oh, well, the credit's phasing down, we got to worry about begun construction. Here it's going to be important because it provides an out to the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements, which is going to be important, I think, as we sort of figure out exactly how these work. So what are the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements? Sean talked about this a little bit earlier, but it's, making sure that the laborers and the mechanics and the people constructing the project are paid, prevailing wages. So this requirement would apply not only during the construction period of the project, but also like your O&M, right? Alteration and repair of the project. And you say, okay, well, the ITC, for example, is a, upfront investment tax credit. How does that work? And it's like, well, these requirements apply for the sort of a relevant credit period. So for the PTC, that's, you know, your 10-year period. If it's the ITC, it's your recapture period of 5 years that you're looking at there. And so that's sort of the prevailing wage requirement. One thing that we've been asked already is, okay, well, is this like, are we going to get compared to like a national average, right? Because I'm in X state and that state just isn't paying wages that are in line with the national average. And it's locality based. I'm not an employment lawyer, but we have those people, as Sean and Lauren said before. It's based on like the Davis-Bacon Act, and there are specific places you can go to like figure out what, you know, for a specific type of job in a specific locality, there's kind of a, the government collects information and you can kind of figure out what the prevailing wage is. And if one is not established, there's a process for figuring that, you know, getting one established.
So just to pause there, so the Department of Labor actually publishes the prevailing wage for separate locations and for separate types of job classes. So it's not a secret. You don't have to guess whether you're paying prevailing wage. You just need to go to the database and make sure that your wages are consistent with what is being published.
Yeah, and so then sort of similar concept, but that we need to train people up in this space. So people are going to be displaced, right? And so making sure there's apprentices working on these projects so that they can gain the appropriate skills. Apprentices don't have to be paid prevailing wages, but there is sort of a applicable percentage that ratchets up. I think it goes from 10 to 15% depending on when you begun construction. Again, that begun construction concept relevant to sort of the threshold that you have to meet for the apprenticeship. There are cure options in both the wage and the apprenticeship provisions. There are even harsher sort of, well, I should say the cure options. You might say, well, how does that work? How does a cure option work? You actually have to go back in and, like in the prevailing wage concept, pay the employee what they should have been paid plus interest and, you know, benefits that might have been left out. So you actually are going to have to go track down those people and true them up if there is a foot fault. So you want to make sure from the get-go that, you know, you've complied with these provisions. But then there are, if you intentionally do not comply, the cure options are, you know, exorbitant. I would say it gets multiplied by 3, right? It becomes much more expensive in that circumstance. So it also, I think, brings into question, Sean, you've made this point, right? You know, they phrase it as a base credit and sort of an adder, but are the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements really that optional, right? You're starting with such a low base, and you kind of need the adder, and also the penalties associated with it make it such that, you know, do you really have, if this gets enacted, it's unclear whether or not there's really a choice.
Yeah, no, we're going to be spending a lot of time kind of, if this is enacted, kind of trying to sort this out, kind of just in terms of optionality, right? The intentional disregard kind of be if you just decide not to pay kind of prevailing wage, and then you're stuck with kind of these significant penalties. So you better sort it out. Plus you stand to lose the ITC if you don't. So there's a lot at stake. And what's even more daunting, and just in terms of how we look at transactions and diligence, you know, you can look at your contractor and then you have to look through to the subcontracts and sort those out. So this is going to kind of need quite a bit of attention with respect to compliance on a go-forward basis.
Now that we've sufficiently freaked everyone out, just keep in mind that this likely does not apply to anything really in development now. You should be able to meet the beginning of construction exception, but this will be a go-forward requirement that we'll all need to be mindful on and be very smart on.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll also move now to a happier topic, maybe, if we go to the next slide. Okay, so there, as Lauren mentioned, like stacking, right? So another thing that this legislation would provide for are a number of bonuses. And the bonuses kind of go to sort of all of the big picture goals Sean was talking about at the beginning, right? Encouraging domestic manufacturing and production. And so one way they do that is through a domestic content bonus. Taxpayers would be eligible for a 10% adder if you meet the requirements of the domestic content requirements. And so that's, you have to be able to certify that your steel, iron, and manufactured products were produced in the United States. For manufactured products, it doesn't have to be all of the manufactured product, it has to be 40%. And then there's an exception also for offshore, kind of recognizing that that industry is mainly housed sort of elsewhere right now. So that is only a 20% requirement there for offshore wind right now. So that's one to, you know, just really encourage investment in the United States. We have heard that this is one of the provisions that, you know, they're sort of looking at specifically in the bird review. We can go to the next slide. All right, so 2 more credits. I'm actually going to hit on the energy community credit first. So this is another 10% adder. And just to clarify, in the PTC space, that means, you know, you're actually getting another like 10% of credit. In the ITC space, that means you would go from like 30% ITC to 40% ITC. It's a percentage points adder. It's not you know, create your credit and then multiply by 0.1 and figure out what additional amount would be. And then, so energy community, what would that mean? We've kind of joked that this is at least right now a get lucky provision because you probably already have your projects in, you know, sort of lined up as to where you're going to put them. But what this would do is encourage investment in sort of displaced communities going forward. So if it's a tract that has a brownfield site or census tracts, or the directly adjoining census tract where a coal mine has closed since 1999, or a coal-fired power plant was retired after December 31st, 2009. And then also this provision, part of the bill, had kind of had some back and forth before. One of the things that is in here is that it's an area that had significant employment basically in the oil and gas space. And so this is all meant to sort of, you know, realize that there is going to be displacement, but making sure that we're reinvesting in the areas that, you know, are suffering from that displacement. So that would be another bonus that can be stacked with the domestic content bonus as written. I should also note that these bonuses, depending on the credit, are subject to a similar sort of breakdown of base and extra amount, and you only get 20% of the bonus. So like in the ITC space, you get a 2% adder if you don't satisfy prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements, and you only get the full 10% if you're doing the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements. Then low income communities, I'm just going to do this one really briefly. There's an additional 10 to 20% here. This one you'd have to apply for. So a little bit harder to get. The projects also have to be small, less than 5 megawatts. So the secretary is supposed to establish a program on how to allocate those. They're allowed to allocate 1.8 gigawatts of direct current in 2023 and 2024, and thereafter it goes down to 0. So I think we can.
So just as we're flipping the slides there, your takeaway here, I think, is right with the way this is structured. For a solar facility, you could have up to 50% in investment tax credit if it's in the right place, domestic content, satisfy the prevailing wage. Yeah, it's incredibly large.
Right, and 70% really if you're also in a low-income community. And so what Mary touched on is really concepts that are applicable to all of the credits that that are in the bill. There's the prevailing wage and labor or apprenticeship requirements that are applicable to get the full amount of the credit. And then there's these bonuses that you can add on top of the various credits. Not all of them apply, but as a general matter, a lot of the credits and the extended credits have the ability to have these bonuses. So we're just going to hit on, kind of some of the more specifics of the credits and the extensions versus PTC. So this applies wind, solar, geothermal, biomass, landfill gas, trash, hydropower, marine. a whole long asset class that you can get a production tax credit for currently. This would be extended out until the end of 2024. It also adds solar to the list of assets that can be eligible for a production tax credit, which is very exciting. Currently, you couldn't take a PTC for solar. You're stuck with only using the ITC. One interesting thing to note here is that the legislation included some additional provisions that made clear they really want you to be an owner of the underlying PTC facility. So unlike in the ITC space, where we can sometimes use certain lease structures, those still don't seem to be available for PTC structures. Next slide. All right, so same for ITC. This is extended out until the end of 2024. The exciting thing here is that, and Sean touched on this, standalone storage is added. Under current law, in order for storage to be eligible for an investment tax credit, it needed to be charged pretty much exclusively from a renewable resource. This new legislation gets rid of that requirement. So it really doesn't matter how you charge your storage or from what source, it is eligible for an investment tax credit under the new legislation. And again, as we note here, you get those bonuses, and we joked, up to 70% potentially if you get really lucky.
So, and just to say it right, what you were touching upon, just in terms of kind of, fortunately, we have it for solar. I mean, sometimes that's just too much kind of tax capacity being used in one location, kind of in 1 year. So to be able to kind of move over and just have it, have the PTC available on a solar facility, geothermal, hydro, it is really incredibly encouraging, right? Just in terms of kind of almost helping the solar market. There is a bottleneck these days with respect to kind of having success financing all the solar facilities that sponsors kind of have in the market, just given, the capacity limitations. So it's pretty neat.
All right, next slide. Thanks, Sean. So, we just talked about the extension of the PTC and ITC through the end of 2024. After 2024, we transitioned to a technology neutral credit regime. This would apply at least until 2032, potentially longer. And it essentially gives you an investment tax credit or a production tax credit that looks very similar to the credits we currently have. And the amounts would be consistent with the amounts that we would currently have. But instead of limiting the asset classes that are eligible for the credits, it's basically available to any sort of energy generating technology or energy storage, as long as the greenhouse gas emissions rate is 0. Next slide. So Mary, I'll just keep going, Mary.
Okay.
So 45Q, this is our carbon capture tax credit. It would also be extended through the end of 2032. So not only is it extended, but the threshold for being eligible for the credit is significantly reduced. I won't go through it. We've laid it out on the slides, but the upshot here is that any facility is just much more easier for them to qualify for these credits and get the benefit of a 45Q credit for the carbon that they're capturing.
Yeah, I think right now we're seeing a lot of taxpayers struggle to sort of figure out if they can aggregate different things to get to the necessary thresholds, and this would alleviate a lot of that sort of consternation.
Yeah. Next slide. So not only is it easier to qualify, if you do qualify, the amount of your credit is significantly reduced or significantly increased, I should say. So if you're doing pure sequestration of your captured carbon, that's an $85 per metric ton of carbon captured, $35 more than what is in the current legislation. If you're able to do direct air capture, and if you are, give us a call. We'd love to hear about it. That credit is potentially as high as $180 per metric ton. Next slide. All right, so these are two new credits that we're really excited about. As Sean mentioned, hydrogen is going to be a big piece, or should be a big piece, of the energy transition. this legislation would provide either an investment tax credit or a production tax credit for hydrogen, clean hydrogen production. If we're in the PTC world, it's $3 per kilogram. That reduces down based off of the amount of carbon oxide equivalent that is produced as the clean hydrogen is produced. And same for ITC, 30% kind of headline credit. That is also reduced as the amount of carbon oxide equivalent produced moves up in the production process. I think we'd expect, though, for green hydrogen, which is basically hydrogen that is produced through electrolyzing water by a renewable asset, that's likely eligible for the full headline credit.
And Lauren hit this, but just to remind folks, right? If you use a renewable facility like a wind facility or solar to electrolyze, you have the wind credit, or ITC if you like, as well as kind of the hydrogen credit. So there's the combination is available. And like Lauren said, just to point it out, right, there's gradations here with respect to the amount of the credit you're entitled to, depending on the emissions. There's 4 categories now. I think previously government had suggested that might be 6 or 8 kind of thing. And it's essentially trying to, it's as you get closer to the green, the credit kind of goes up. It's just one way to think about it.
Right. And the other, sorry, Sean. No, I was just gonna say,
you go.
The other credit is the nuclear power production credit. It's styled as a PTC for energy produced from a nuclear resource. Interestingly, it applies for kind of existing nuclear facilities. So any facility that had been mothballed or just otherwise wasn't kind of operating at full scale. This might induce more nuclear production because you'd have a tax credit for doing so. All right, let's go 2 slides forward, please. There we go. All right, so the next couple slides cover the kind of domestic manufacturing incentives. This first one is an extension of a currently existing credit. It's basically a 30% investment tax credit for either installing or re-equipping a facility which is used to produce renewable energy or clean energy type components, EVs, or just other equipment that is designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. You do have to apply for this one, and it's capped. So I think it's 10 trillion for all taxpayers, but is a way to encourage domestic manufacturing.
And I think about 48C is kind of, we've talked about a bunch of credits and a bunch of assets. 48C is almost like stuff that the government has not thought about. Then you can make an application, indicate that you've got this technology that's, going to accomplish the goals that are set forth in the statute. And then you have the credit available to you. So this is kind of like if we didn't think about it, you still have an opportunity to kind of take advantage of a credit. Come talk to us.
All right, next slide. So this next one, this is a credit for the manufacturing of certain components. So basically you get a tax credit for each component that you manufactured in the US and sold in the US. Next slide. This is just a good slide just to show you the scope of what's included. So again, if you produce these components, you get a credit for each component manufactured. Next slide. The cool thing about this legislation is you also get a credit for production of critical minerals. We've got 49 listed here. So any production in the US of these critical minerals will give you a tax credit. And that's equal to 10% of the costs incurred to produce those credits.
Oh, it's worth the electric vehicles, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know. Do we want to skip forward, given I think we've only got a few minutes left to the flexibility provisions?
Yeah, it's the electric vehicles. More to come on that. We'll probably have to publish something on that. Next slide, please. Renewable fuels. I know a lot of you folks are really interested in kind of the renewable fuels. It's mostly extensions for the next couple of years of those provisions, and then it slides into kind of a production credit that kind of wraps all of these existing provisions into this just clean production kind of credit. And it operates much like the technology neutral provision operates. It just has a measurement of kind of where the fuel is coming from and its efficiency and cleanliness type of thing. Next slide, please. Resi, why don't we hop over Resi? Apologize to all you individuals that are interested in this, but I think we're kind of running short on time. We'll come back to this stuff. Next slide, please. Do you want to start on this, Mary?
Sure. So one of the things that this bill legislation would add is a direct pay provision. And if people reviewed prior iterations, that had been sort of a consistent feature in sort of prior versions. But one of the big things here is who it's available to. So I guess first, what is direct pay? Direct pay would be treated as if you had made sort of like an overpayment of your taxes. So you'd actually be able to get sort of a refund of that amount. And so, but who is it available to now? Well, the availability has sort of significantly shrunk in most respects to sort of tax exempt state and local governments, the Tennessee Valley Authority, you can see them up on the slide, right? So it's a very small subset. It is not sort of your typical taxpayer who's eligible for direct pay. There's a big caveat to that for some of the industries that they, I think, appropriately recognize need some runway to get off the ground, that being 45Q with carbon capture, the clean hydrogen credit, and also advanced manufacturing. Those are generally available for direct pay. For 45Q and hydrogen, it's sort of limited to the first 5-year period, but sort of with the idea that should give people some time to sort of establish their proof of concept, right? Hey, look, I put this together. I took direct pay for the first 5 years, and 45Q, you got another 7 years remaining. Look, it works. Like, I can either sell you the credits, or you can come in as a tax equity investor, or you could monetize the credits in some other manner. And we can go to the next slide. So you can see there that most of the credits we've been discussing are sort of on this list. I think one of the important things to note here is it can be on a facility by facility basis, right? Which in the wind space could be turbine by turbine. We can keep going. So transferability, Sean, Lauren, one of y'all want to take this one?
Sure, I'll start and move quickly. So this is entirely new from this legislation. It basically permits taxpayers to sell tax credits. And so Sean joked at the outset that this is something that tax equity lawyers would never permit and would never speak the name of previously. This legislation basically says you can in fact sell a tax credit to an unrelated third party who is able to take that tax credit and put it on their own tax return as a reduction to their tax bill. Again, there's a long list of eligible credits, pretty much all of the ones we've talked about so far, plus a few more. Next page. And so this is just some of the kind of mechanics around transferability, and it is, a little bit complicated, and we probably could have an entire session on just transferability, what it means for the tax equity market, what it means for sponsors, what it means for folks that want to, start up a tax credit fund. There's tons of cool opportunities that we're all excited about and think will be beneficial for all players in the market. There are, some sort of restrictions on it. Mostly you can't retransfer a credit. It's one time, but you can choose to transfer all or a portion of it. Another limitation is anything held by a partnership needs to be transferred at the partnership level, not at the partner level. So it will be something that partners would need to negotiate about.
And this, like Lauren said, this is kind of, it's new and it's going to be developing, and it'll probably just kind of raise kind of opportunity. It'll raise kind of at least kind of relief in the sense that I have more credits than I hoped for. It can kind of just, what I was touching upon a little earlier, it at least gives the ability with all of these credits that you can move them around and bring the capital into the space that we really need so we can kind of successfully transition. So it's I think we should all view this as really helpful just in terms of kind of this whole kind of concept that we're trying to accomplish here. So I think we're up against the time. Do we have anything else here? I don't think.
No, it's just if we flip to the last slide, we had our email addresses up on the first slide. You can find them easily on the website. We moved super quickly. There is a ton in this legislation. Hopefully we will know whether it has any viability in the next few days. But please don't hesitate to reach out. You know, much of our knowledge base learned over the past few days has been from intelligent questions and some not so intelligent questions from folks. So, you know, send them our way. We're always happy to entertain them.
Thank you all. This is all exciting stuff. More to come.
Thanks, everyone.